And I'm going to go back to the first of these conversations that we held just a year ago, which featured the Century Foundation's Richard Collenberg. He described our program as a catapult over invisible walls of segregation that have kept generations of families in lower resource neighborhoods because of the hangover of redlining. We're participating as Move to Prosper in the solutions we want to discuss tonight. How do we create inclusivity across Central Ohio? So without further ado, I want to introduce Gene Slater. He has served as senior advisor on housing for federal, state, and local agencies for over 40 years. He co-founded and chairs CSG Advisors, which has been one of the nation's leading advisors on affordable housing for decades, including for more than half the states and half the 50 largest cities, financing homes and affordable rental units for more than 400,000 families. He received degrees from Columbia, MIT, and Stanford, as well as the Loeb Fellowship, which is a partner of Building Inclusive Communities. And he's joined us from the Bay Area. Gene, welcome to Columbus.
Thank you very much.
We're going to get into this a little bit later, but Gene has already spent some time wandering around Columbus this morning and this afternoon. Being wandered in a bus, the best way, right? But I want to start with some background about your book. And it's so, I realized that you were coming and I needed to read the book, but I had just finished Color of Law this summer, and many of you I know have read that. And they tell a very similar story about how widespread and intentional segregation was, but there is no mention in Color of Law, or frankly, anything else I've read on the job for Move to Prosper, that makes this connection between the Realtors Association and the housing segregation like your book does. So I want to ask you to help us understand how your research helped tell this story, how you pulled this distinct fact out and made a book out of it. But first, before you dig in, I want to recognize that the Columbus Realtors are members of their DEI committee are in the house with us tonight. Nationally, the Realtors have long since come around to the idea of DE&I, and we're really pleased to have the local Columbus Realtor Association not only be with us tonight, but be very much partnered with Building Inclusive Communities and in fact, a financial supporter of Move to Prosper. So thank you for being here. So tell us about the research. How'd you figure this out?
So let me just distinguish. So Color of Law is a book. It was really, Rothstein is an education lawyer arguing de facto versus de jure segregation, and arguing the government really had a hand in segregation and this was official policy. So it's really sort of a brief from that perspective. And what I tried to do was to go back and look how segregation got created. And when you tell that story, you realize it was a creation of the organized real estate industry that they then used and became the implementers of the federal programs to work with that institutionalized what they had already begun with before. So what do you want me?
And you've tripped across this as part of your work, or you went looking for an explanation, or how did you? Color of Law is, I started to describe it to people as it's like a catalog.
Yes.
Now here's the same example, but now it's not Anaheim. It's it's
right.
Annapolis.
Right. So where I started from, I actually started this from two perspectives. One, having worked in this field of affordable housing for 40 years, having a background in city planning, it was sort of amazing that I knew so little of this history. That's what really stood out to me. And that the leaders of the state housing finance agencies that I work with, many of whom are minorities, when I started telling them what I was learning, they didn't know the story either. So it's sort of a story that's been largely forgotten. And it seems to me very important to understand that history in order to understand what is its legacy and how does that legacy impact us. So that was one dimension. And secondly, this actually came about, I was taking a class on human rights and literature at Stanford in a Master of Liberal Arts in the evening program. And one of the questions I kept thinking about was the use of the word freedom to oppose civil rights, and how on almost every issue, you hear that language. So I was wondering, where did that language come from? Has it always been that way? Has it always been used that way? And when I started tracking that back, it tracked back, in fact, to an argument the realtors created as a way to maintain and continue segregation. That led me further back to where did that come from? And how did segregation begin? And how did these justifications evolve? And that led basically to the beginning of the 20th century, to the beginning of the organized real estate industry, which is now the National Association of Realtors, was local real estate boards that were created at the beginning of the 20th century, some of the most established real estate dealers in each city at a time when real estate, as I was saying to Michael last night, was sort of, they view as the Wild West of real estate. It was before real estate licensing or regulation. And to be a real estate man, that was the term, there were no women at the time, to be a real estate man was somebody, was a shyster or a scoundrel, and they were trying to distinguish themselves. So they created this organization of what they called the best men in realty, and trademarked the name realtor, created these realty boards that were original. I'm just giving you a little context so you understand where this came from. So, and they were a very small and exclusive group. So in Los Angeles, 40 out of the 2,000 real estate brokers formed this organization with similar percentages in other cities, in Denver, in St. Louis, and so forth. And yet, by creating, so they created a small, they saw themselves as a private exclusive club modeled on a stock exchange. And the multiple listing service was like a stock exchange with actual cards, like the equivalent of stocks for each property, that copies of which would be in each realtor's office. Using this, they were the power of the multiple listing service and cooperative listings and the sort of cooperative competition, they were able quickly to dominate the field of real estate and quickly controlled 80% of home sales. Even though there were a tiny minority of brokers, they became incredibly politically powerful. By mid-20th century, Herbert Nelson, the executive secretary, was viewed by Congress as the most powerful lobbyist in Washington. And at the same time, they were, we now think of realtors primarily as sales agents for individual homes. But the realtors began, they included what became the Home Builders, National Association of Home Builders was a spinoff, the appraisers and the National Appraisal Institute, the Property Management Institute, and so forth. This was the organized real estate industry. And when I look back where segregation came from, what it took was the creation of an organized group to, in fact, organize segregation. Should I just...
Yeah, give us some examples. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So there were two. So if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, one of the myths, there are a lot of myths that have been created and are still in many people's heads, including mine, as I started doing this research, was the notion that segregation, residential segregation was normal. I mean, it was natural. It was how things had always been. This was historic. And it turned out that was a myth promulgated by the realtors. And during all this time, I'm talking about the realtors from 1903 to 1968, and the legacy of what they did on their letterhead, the National Association, it's learning from them the past. And they very openly admit this when I'm going to describe, all of which came from their archives, to deal with the future. So I'm trying to learn from that past. Anyway, the realtors start at the time, in the beginning of the 20th century, cities in the country were not racially segregated. This was like a surprise to me to look back and look at the statistics and the analysis in every region of the country. And to give an example, in Los Angeles in 1904, a Black real estate broker wrote about the Negroes of this city have proudly refused to segregate themselves and live in many of the areas with the best services and the best infrastructure. A dozen years later, a woman in the same city used the words I think you said about invisible walls. She said, "The whites have erected invisible walls and prevented us from going beyond them." This happened in like a 12-year period. The very same time. And so segregation was invented. This was not the way things were. This was a new thing. The time where you lived depended on, where you could afford, not your ancestry. Often neighborhoods were mixed economically as well. So this was a new invention. So how did this invention come about? Two key figures for this. First, if you want to guess where segregation began, I suspect the place you won't think of it beginning was not in the South. It was a mile and a half from the University of California campus in Berkeley. It was the first residentially restricted subdivision in the United States. Racially restricted. Started by a guy named Duncan McDuffie, was a leading realtor, an ardent environmentalist. He was later national president, twice national president of the Sierra Club, created the Save the Redwoods League, a leader of progressive Republicans. Many of the realtors were saw themselves in the mode of Teddy Roosevelt, a progressive reformist. He decided he wanted to build high-end subdivision, the highest end subdivision in the Bay Area, with curving streets, bringing in the Olmsted brothers of Central Park for design and landscaping, keep the trees and so forth. And to this, at a time before zoning, he used what had begun as a set of covenants, which an owner would sign, anybody buying a lot, limiting what could be done on that lot. Like, you can't tear down the trees, you have to build a house at least this distance from the street. And you can't build a tenement. And there's other ways of limiting, because as a land developer, we were meeting with the EOLI yesterday, as a land developer, he's the profit from building such an expensive subdivision and all this investment comes 5 years or 7 years down as you're selling the last lots. So by controlling that, it can control what could happen. So he added to these covenants that have been used in a few places. He added a racial covenant that cost him nothing, and basically simply said, no non-Caucasian can ever occupy, or for the next 30 years, can occupy any of these units unless they're a servant. Okay. And he recorded these covenants. And very similarly, J.C. Nichols in Kansas City, who the Urban Land Institute for 20 years until last year named their National Visionary, Urban Visionary of America award after. J.C. Nichols, head of the real estate board in Kansas City for decades, he created used the same approach and created the first homeowners associations in America to enforce these covenants. So homeowners associations began as a mechanism for this. McDuffie created the first single family zoning in America to prevent an African-American dance hall from being built down the street from the property he occupied. So single family zoning and homeowners associations, and the beginning of fragmented suburbs to largely control planning and zoning, making certain the only subdivisions got built were those with covenants. This quickly spread. These covenants on these high-end subdivisions, Beverly Hills and so forth, quickly spread to middle-class subdivisions within 2 or 3 years, to working-class subdivisions, and then realtors in existing neighborhoods, started in Pasadena and spread across the country. Circulated petitions where the owners would sign and say, if anybody, sells or rents, to a minority, you can sue them to have them evicted, even if they own the house. So this was the beginning. So it was a sales tactic that helped sell homes and put a premium on the sale of homes. And it spread and became widespread so that by the mid-1920s, half the homes in the United States had racial covenants and 3/4 of the new houses. So this was a pattern. Segregation was invented as the airplane was invented. Not as a deliberate, all thought out scheme of restricting where certain people could live, but rather as a way of selling exclusivity. And the one other thing I'll say before you go to the next question is, when they first started selling these lots this way, buyers said, well, this is kind of un-American. You're telling me what I can do with the land I'm buying from you. Nichols salesman in Kansas City. And his salesman answered back and said, no. It's not the restrictions on you which matter. It's the restrictions on the neighbors which count. And that idea that you had a right, an exclusive right to a community and the right to exclude others. This was something new in America, something new associated with real estate, this right to exclude. And that was the basis of this. So you start seeing some of the legacy of these arguments as they've, and mechanisms as they've continued today.
So who was springing up to fight it? These housing covenants start coming online. There's no response. There's no response from powerful people, lawsuits. How did people respond?
Yeah, there were lawsuits that were filed against an African-American traffic policeman in Los Angeles who bought a home and had the temerity to move into it. And so the realtors sponsored the court case about this to enforce these covenants. And it went to the California Supreme Court, who decided that, yes, we couldn't restrict the ability to sell a home because that would restrict the right of alienation going back in English common law, but there's nothing to prevent limiting who can live in it. That's kind of like zoning. And so people could own homes that they would be evicted from. And this happened. And so the lawsuits were typically over in those situations.
And it wasn't just Blacks that were excluded, right?
Right. So as I said, Caucasians. So what did Caucasian mean? Caucasian, it turned out, meant basically whoever the local real estate board decided was a problem. One of the things I did in my research, you can look online at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. It was a survey done in 1927 of real estate boards throughout California, asking them at behalf of a Stanford professor, who is the problem group in your community? And it was a box: Negroes, Japanese, Chinese, Mexicans. And describe are there any other problems, and how are you dealing with those problems? And each real estate board in this confidential survey reported back, and they said, oh, the Western Negro is a problem. They keep wanting to improve their position. They keep wanting to move into better neighborhoods. Mexicans in this area are okay. Or our problem isn't either of those, it's Chinese, or it's Japanese, or it's this, or it's that. And who this applied to was all of those groups, clearly, but also if you look at these surveys and then you look around the country at the covenants, Russians, Poles, Greeks, Italians, Catholics generally, Jews, Hindus. In fact, a Sikh man from, Kashmir claimed in a Supreme Court case that he was in fact exactly what was meant by Caucasian. He was closer to Caucasian genetically than anybody else. And the Supreme Court said, well, for the social purposes of this covenant, you're not Caucasian. So that's what it meant. And it was only as various groups allowed being treated as white, and the real estate board started allowing that to happen kind of in the 1940s, that other groups were allowed to move into these restricted areas. So what was left behind in the formerly mixed areas that were the older cities were only those people who couldn't who couldn't move out, which had become, when we talked to FHA, had become disinvestment zones.
Okay. So piece together for us, then you said these kind of started at the developer level, and it was a little bit of a grassroots learning from one another as a way to make more money. So how do the realtor boards start to systematize the racism?
Okay, so they found that by 1920 or so, they had taken on a new role, which I defined, they didn't use this word. They became not only salesmen, their normal role, they became anti-salesmen. They became viewed as the racial gatekeepers of each community, the local real estate board. They're reviewed that way by public officials. Often members of the real estate association would get themselves on the planning board in city after city, where they would then they would turn down any subdivision that didn't have racial covenants. Okay. The Supreme Court had said, you can't use zoning, that violates the 14th Amendment, that's directly right. So it was now up to the realtors and racial covenants to systematize this. But to do this by the argument they were making, which is one minority doctor or lawyer moving into a neighborhood was going to ruin that neighborhood, they now found themselves, they had to prevent a single sale. So in the survey, they talk about, oh, we've formed a MeetX committee in order to keep people from buying. And if somebody buys a home, we're going to make certain he sells it to us, or we're going to, anyway, every method you could imagine was used around the country. And the realtors built into their code of ethics, in 1924, a statement that no realtor shall sell a property or to a person who will reduce the value of the surrounding area, depreciate the value. They created a myth. They called it an axiom, but as a scientific objective statement that they got in every real estate textbook in the country, which they sponsored, in 165 universities, that if minorities moved into white neighborhoods, property values would go down by 30% or 50%. They're all stated as fact. And it was this, and this was used and said for, it's the Portland Real Estate Board in 1920, we have no prejudice. It's because this would reduce property values, and we're the people charged with protecting property values. So this became accepted by every land economist in the country. It was, I'll get to it when we get to it chronologically, this was a lie, and it was based on no evidence. But this became the standard around the country. And when FHA was created in the midst of the Depression, the Roosevelt administration turned to the realtors, Herbert Nelson, their executive director, secretary, helped design FHA. They were the key lobbyists for FHA. They were the chief underwriter, became the chief underwriter for FHA. The head of research for the realtors became the head of research, head of mapping became the head of mapping. So the realtors viewed FHA as their agency, the federal government, and it was probably the most successful government program maybe ever, and certainly in real estate, because it created long-term amortizing mortgages. It costs less to buy a house than to rent, and with lower and lower down payments. But it was limited to whites, except for very small number of segregated subdivisions in the South. And that happened in two ways. One was FHA emphasized new construction. And they said, we'll give you, in the middle of, picture this, in the middle of the Depression, we'll give you a conditional commitment to a developer. Every house you build will provide FHA insurance, 100% insurance to the bank. Okay, so you can sell the houses. So a developer with that in hand could go out and get a loan from a bank for 100% of the construction costs in the middle of the Depression. Okay? This is how major home builders came about. Before that, there were just small scale builders. At the same time, and FHA required you had to have a racial covenant for that subdivision, or they wouldn't approve it. That was federal policy. At the same time, for existing areas, they created the redlining maps, which actually, since they had no staff, they turned to 3 realtors in each city, older established men, this is how it was written, over 50 years old, who knew the community for the last 25 years, to describe what were the areas at risk. Risk meaning minorities or industry. And the redlining maps established those then. We now talk about redlining maps, so everybody sort of knew about them. I have them in the frontispiece of my book, and they're all over any website. Until the 1980s, nobody knew about these. These were kept secret by FHA. They were numbered, and these had an incredibly powerful effect. So just tell one version of this, which is in 2017, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago did an analysis of every redlining map in the United States, in every 350 metropolitan areas, all of which were done in exactly the same way. And what they found was that when those areas had been set up along a street boundary, 3 blocks on either side, 6 blocks on either side, there was very little difference because they were creating arbitrary, they had to create a boundary somewhere in the middle of a neighborhood and say, this is a red zone, this is a yellow zone, we'll make a loan here, we won't make it there. When they looked at at the time, there was very little difference. They looked 80 years later, 2017, and they found enormous differences by that dividing line. in home ownership, in house price, in condition and deterioration, and disinvestment. What FHA created was basically 100% investment zone where anybody, where you could get a white person could get a loan. The new suburbs or in these blue and green areas, and other areas where nobody could get a loan from them. And the banks used the same maps. So this created disinvestment. So when I started working in housing, 1970, looking at every abandoned building in South Bronx, I looked around cities and they all seemed to have the same pattern of this central city ghetto. And here are these whites. How did this happen? It happened in exactly the same way in every city. So it seemed sort of like natural because it was simply done in exactly the same way in every city, where investment happened here and disinvestment happened there. And then the people who were prevented from moving out and who couldn't buy homes and lost out on the opportunity to buy homes at a time when FHA made household wealth possible, they were then blamed for the disinvestment that had happened to the areas they were forced to remain living in, typically paying 20 to 30% more of their 20 to 30% more for the same quality housing because they couldn't move like any black market. So that's why this property value axiom was a fake. And they appraisers started, doing studies in the 1940s. Luigi Laurenti at Berkeley went out and he asked every professor who'd written one of these textbooks, said, where was the data for, your statement about this scientific statement? And it turned out there was no data. This had been invented and just assumed because all the economists and all the appraisers, they were working with the real estate industry's mindset, which is the only customers who mattered. The only person whose house values mattered were those of white people. If minorities were forced to pay 20% more to a speculator to move in, well, that was irrelevant because then the white real estate industry wouldn't control it. Sorry.
I want to get to some of the rest of the hangover. What are we experiencing now as it relates to redlining? But I want to just briefly give you a chance to sort of set up one of the central battles in your book, which happens in California.
Okay. So after this, in the 1940s, the Supreme Court in Shelley versus Kramer in 1948 said you can't use racial covenants. So the realtors reacted in apocalyptic tones. The Los Angeles board, the California board, drafted a US constitutional amendment to overturn the 14th Amendment and would provide specifically for apartheid for zones for African Americans, because they said otherwise it's a menace to the family life of our nation as we have known it. And so much for the scientific statements. And then on the advice of their lawyers, as you read through the files, they were told, you can do this more quietly. You can do this by racial steering. You can do this using homeowners associations. You can do this in other ways. So effectively that by 1960, 98% of new homes and 95% of existing homes were off limits to African Americans in this country. Fair housing folks started sponsoring laws to overcome this. They thought Shelley was going to make it possible, people to live anywhere. And the realtors had so organized segregation that was impossible. So when a fair housing law passed in California in 1963, the realtors nationally poured money into a campaign that would be a national model. And they used a similar effort in the Ohio legislature, but the key battle was in California. And it was called Proposition 14. They put on the ballot now a state constitutional amendment. You can see the history here. A state constitutional amendment that would permanently prohibit any city or county or the state itself from ever limiting an owner's discrimination. Okay, forever. And to make this argument, the height of the civil rights movement, the height of American liberalism, when Lyndon Johnson was defeating Goldwater 60-40 on the same ballot, they put this amendment, but they needed an argument that wouldn't seem racist. So what was their argument? They said, we're in favor of colorblind freedom, the equal rights of all, which is the right to discriminate. That was what they meant by individual freedom. And they used the slogan, freedom of choice. They put it on every billboard, every billboard sign that they used throughout on Los Angeles freeways. They created this notion of individual freedom of choice as being what was at stake, likening it to freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Those were the languages they used, basically using the language of libertarianism to enforce a restricted community or enforce conformity. That combination proved incredibly powerful. When this amendment was held unconstitutional 2 years later, while Ronald Reagan was running for governor, he then picked it up. He and Goldwater hadn't endorsed it because they were afraid of seeing racist at the time. But now seeing that 75% of white voters, 65% of voters supported this in California, a relatively moderate liberal state, meant it could win anywhere because voters could say, I'm not racially prejudiced. I'm in favor of the civil rights law, but this is a matter of supporting individual freedom and freedom of choice. This language was so powerful. And Reagan then in his campaign said, if an individual wants to discriminate against a Negro or other in selling or renting his house, it's his perfect right. It's his right to do so. I shouldn't edit through. It's his right to do so. And he then picked up this language of freedom of choice that the realtors had designed. When fair housing was finally passed in 1968, in the days after Martin Luther King was killed and fires were raging in 100 American cities and there were troops outside guarding the Capitol, it was tremendously weakened from the beginning because of fears of congressmen of seeing what this vote had been in California. And that has shaped the history of fair housing ever since. There was no administrative enforcement mechanism created, and it was weakened then politically by the power of this idea of freedom as being the freedom to discriminate.
So let's come back to some of the hangover. And you were driving around our fair region today. You're 50 years past fair housing. Talk a little bit about some of what you researched, what you've been talking about, and how it applied to where you saw today, because we know that 65% of homeless families in Franklin County are Black, and there's this number 2 in the nation aspect of Columbus. So
yeah. So first of all, I don't think Columbus is particularly distinctive. This was a set of patterns that were created in basically every city in the country in pretty much the same way. So I think what you want to look at is, so here was this law that passed, but there was a legacy that had been put in place through the real estate industry and FHA during all these decades before. What did that legacy consist of? It consisted of homeowners association. It consisted of single family zoning, exclusive single family zoning, of fragmented suburbs that were enforcing that zoning and adding in state legislatures fiscal zoning overlays, which I heard a lot about today, which meant that it was a strong incentive not to have residents move in, to have more jobs or whatever. These suburbs were created precisely to support this system. So those were in place. You also had the political power of this argument so that in the early 1970s, when George Romney, Secretary of HUD, there are 2 parts of fair housing. One is non-discrimination. The other is affirmatively furthering fair housing, saying communities have to be required to accept, inclusion and racial inclusion. Nixon fired him using the language of the realtors still, saying, well, if segregation exists, it's because of the free choice. Nothing to do with this organized system that I've just described. It's a result of free choice. So that is, then finally that got, implemented, briefly by the Obama administration, was curtailed under the Trump administration, Biden administration, presumed that, and some states, they're taking that seriously. And so California now is enforcing housing elements in every city and saying we can override zoning or make requirements if you're not meeting your fair share. In other states, the legislatures and the governors, have opposed that. That's one of the legacies. Okay, so we have in place all these legacies, and the notion that a neighborhood belongs to a single race or belongs to you, and it's your right as a local neighborhood to control who else is there. The same notion from Nichols, marketing thing. It's the restrictions on your neighbors which count. It's our ability to exclude which counts. So this intense localism, rather than the notion that everybody has a right to choose where to live, these were all put in place during this period I'm describing. And so it would have taken strong government action to overcome that legacy, to overcome all that mechanisms and all that legacy. And when you think about the legacy of the self-fulfilling prophecy of the redlining maps, and particularly think about the impact on household wealth. So here, during the generations, when you could build household wealth significantly through home ownership, most significantly through FHA and VA and bank loans, minorities were precluded from that. One Duke study in the 1960s, Chicago alone, showed that Black families lost $3 billion in household wealth by not being able to get mortgage loans. Okay. All as a result of this history. So you compound that to today and today's price values and stuff, and you say, why does segregation persist? It's more like, how could segregation not persist unless there was significant actions to try and overcome these barriers, these invisible walls, and their legacy that had been put in place?
Okay. I know that I will not be the only one who has their blood boiling now, and I already read the book, which is Freedom to Discriminate. We want to turn our attention and we want to bring up our panelists to join the conversation, because we want to talk a little bit about how this hits the ground in Central Ohio with some Central Ohio experts, but we also want to turn to this crowd and help them think about what are the steps that we can take to start really leaning into reversing some of these trends that you've identified. So thank you. Please come on up. As the panelists are coming to the stage, you have cards in the audience here live. If you would like to ask questions, please begin to write those down, and you'll be learning even more here as we go. Also, the online audience can simply type their questions into the chat, and I will get to see all of those when we're ready to take those. We have a volunteer right here, Kathy. She's going to wave her hand when you have yours ready here in a few minutes. She's going to be your guide. She's your Vanna. All right, welcome to the stage, Karina Johnson. She's a member of this year's Columbus CEO Future 50 class, and I wrote down project coordinator, but I think you have a new title for Convergence Columbus. Please share.
Yes, my new title starting October 1st is Project Director under the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio, or AHACO. Very excited about that.
Who's Executive Director we have?
Oh,
Hi, Carly. Congratulations. So Convergence Columbus is a coalition of nonprofit government and housing industry staff working to bridge the Black homeownership gap here in Columbus. Prior to this role, Karina led the financial empowerment efforts at the City of Columbus, and welcome. This is Michael Wilkos, United Way's Vice President of Community Impact. His team develops effective strategies to improve our community and invests in programs provided by funded partners to implement these strategies. Michael, you have a reputation in this city as the data whisperer, and people line up and then they brag about going to see you in person. So thank you for being with us tonight. I'm going to start with you. You've had a chance to hear some of Gene's talk so far and read his book. And what I'd love for you to do is layer on to some of what he set up here, some of the conditions that you're witnessing in Columbus that are really directly related to some of that long ago policy decision.
Great. Well, thank you. And what a pleasure it is to be with all of you this evening. Last night we were at probably a 3-hour-long dinner, and I think by the end I was just sitting like this on the table listening to Gene, because I could have gone for many more hours. So it's a pleasure and honor for you to be with us here in Columbus. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. So in my role, we United Way invest in 92 nonprofits doing work in Franklin County, and they're focused on making sure people's basic needs are met and that kids are on the pathway to academic success. We fund organizations, and the clients that they serve are folks that live at 200% of the federal poverty level. That would be about $24,000 a year per single person. And believe it or not, there's about 400,000 people in Franklin County that live at that level and below. And all of them are struggling to deal with housing vulnerability, and keeping their incomes to match the rising growth of housing costs in this community. So what's interesting, because we are a community-based organization at United Way, we're kind of studying these community level trends. And I spent a lot of time unpacking the 2020 census and what that means to Columbus, and I'll put a few statistics into perspective for you this evening. In the last decade, the city of Columbus grew by about 120,000 people. That was the largest numeric increase we've ever recorded in the city of Columbus history for population growth. All of that growth was due to increases in diversity because the city of Columbus actually lost white residents. It was the second largest increase in population growth ever recorded for Franklin County. All of Franklin County's population growth was due to increases in diversity because Franklin County's white population also dropped. Across this entire community, we saw increases in diversity. The increase in diversity was not an urban Columbus thing. It wasn't the suburban parts of Columbus. And those of you that live here in town know what I mean when I say suburban Columbus, right? Columbus served by the suburban school districts. And the increase in diversity was a beltway thing. Despite this huge increase in diversity, when you look at the map of what neighborhoods are homogeneous and what neighborhoods are diverse, the 6 most homogeneous places presently in all of our metro are Bexley, German Village, Grandview, Arlington, Clintonville, and Worthington. So homogeneity is not just a suburban thing. It can also be within the city limits of Columbus, German Village, and Clintonville. What's fascinating, right, is that of the 6 most homogeneous places in this metro, 5 of them were built under redlining and segregation. And 100 years later, they haven't budged. Well, why is that? You know, why is it that these things were in place for 50 years? The laws have changed, but the outcomes really haven't budged. Now, some of that is those communities that I just mentioned are incredibly popular and strong, and there's this huge multi-generational consumer built into the customer base. So as we know, in places like Grandview Heights, homes in Upper Arlington and Grandview are selling really before they even hit the market because it's friends and people who grew up in Upper Arlington who like to have that. But what that does is it leaves the rest of the city in these neighborhoods where all of our nonprofits are operating to deal with these macro level forces of the population growth at present, but also dealing with the systemic racism and oppression of the past. 2 last statistics. Northland grew faster than Columbus and Franklin County in the last decade. That entire neighborhood added just 484 net housing units, but added 14,000 more residents. And Linden is growing for the first time in 60 years. Linden lost 4% of its housing stock, but grew 7.5% in population. Because all of our nonprofits, right, that are working with kids and making sure basic needs are getting met, what they've been telling us for years, and now what the census has confirmed, for everyone who's living doubled up, for every young person who can't afford that apartment, for that person who says, well, I don't know if I get my own place, if I will be housing vulnerable and not be able to afford the rent, let me live with my friends or family members. That doubling up is not happening in Bexley and Grandview and Clintonville. It's happening all across Linden and Northland. So the interesting thing is now we can look back on these historical documents and understand, well, why is it that the most homogeneous place in the entire metro is the area behind Whole Foods on Lane Avenue, right? I know you've been there, and I know that's not a surprise. What are the most diverse places? Morse Road in Northland, West Broad and Georgesville Road on the far west side, Kimberly Parkway and Hamilton Road. Think about these 1960s and 1970s parts of Columbus. They're not new enough to be competitive. They're not old enough to be interesting to the gentrification movement. And as I'm going to oversimplify my degrees in geography and city regional planning at OSU, the white middle class picks up and moves out. The black middle class picks up and moves out because the black population in Columbus is quickly suburbanizing Westerville, Gahanna, New Albany, Reynoldsburg, and Pickerington. And the largest increase in the white population is Mount Vernon Avenue and Long Street. So now there's this racial flip-flop happening, right? That is all connected to systemic racism and oppression, a housing market that's not building anywhere near enough units, and our places that were built under redlining and segregation look like it's 1920. Some crazy stuff going on, right? And so for me, as someone who loves history and also has studied urban planning like Karina and Gene, the question is, what is it about what's happening right now in this very moment that we will judge decades from today with a far more critical lens? The fact that Linden is ground zero for investors buying property, renovating that stuff or flipping that product and keeping it in the rental market, we are victimizing low-income families in Linden just as much as we ever have. We're not talking about it. It's all cause there. That's the kind of stuff that weighs on my mind as I get to this kind of conversation.
Thank you, Michael. And I just wanted to observe as you were talking about the number of people doubling up and trying to live in the basement and all that sort of thing. That's exactly what's happening with our new class at Move to Prosper. We've just recruited 16 new families to enter our program. Half of them are coming from definitional homelessness. They're doubled up, right? They're coming from mom's basement or sister's couch. So we're really seeing the effects of that very directly.
And I'll give you a very tangible number here. Every single day, there's 44 more people living in Franklin County than when the day started. And on an annual basis, there's 16,000 more people in Franklin County every 12 months, which means we have to build an entire city of Worthington or an entire city of Bexley every 12 months. 16,000 people a year. On average, we've been building housing for 8,000 people a year. That's why the housing market is behaving the way it is. Not enough supply, too much demand, and low and moderate income people in places like Northland and Linden are falling victim because there's more and more low and moderate income people, and the supply for them is not budging.
Karina, let's get you involved. So Convergence Columbus is working to increase Black homeownership. What do you reflect on as Michael's sharing some of those stats? Or are there other ways that you think about that data, different data points that you might share for us to better understand what Black households and other people of color in Central Ohio are struggling with given these data?
Yeah, so I'm really excited to be able to sit on a panel and talk about homeownership. I consider myself a bit of a homeownership evangelist. I'm a first generation homeowner, and I feel like I can say I am building wealth. And I guess I would say the first question, the most important question I'd want to answer is why homeownership? And I think you probably know the answer to that, but I can share a little bit about kind of the statistical reason. So we know that homeownership is the primary way that working class folks in our country build wealth. And nationally, the average homeowner has 80 times the net worth of the average renter. And that's not really surprising if you think about the fact that the average renter might not have any assets. So their net worth might be zero, or it might actually be negative because if they owe any debt at all, then they're going to have a negative net worth. So 80 times more net worth for homeowners. So we need to get more homeowners. We need to make more homeowners happen. Here in Columbus, we, like nationally, have a racial homeownership gap. We have white households that are achieving homeownership at twice the rate of Black households, and matching that, Black households have twice the number of mortgage denials. And so, one of the things that I think is important to point out is that the average household who might not be able to buy a house technically is probably paying rent every month that's equal to, or maybe even greater than, what their mortgage payment would be. Yet they're not considered mortgage ready, and they're getting denied when they try. So to put kind of I think it's going to be a positive spin, but I'm going to say, why is that happening? So I'll answer the why question, but I think it's going to end up having a positive spin at the end, or at least I'm going to try. So one of the why reasons, the big why reasons, ends up being about credit. So here in Franklin County, communities of color, 57% of communities of color have some form of delinquent debt. So that's debt that's in over 60 days past due, maybe in collections. So that can be medical debt, student debt, an auto loan, a credit card. But the median delinquent debt for those households is only $1,400. So that means these households might be only $1,400 away from increasing their credit score to the amount needed to be able to buy a house. They probably don't know that, or maybe they don't know what to do about it, or maybe they don't even know that that old debt is still on their credit report. So that's one thing. The other thing is about banking access. So we also find that 20% or 1 in 5 Black households in Franklin County are not using traditional banking. So we call them unbanked kind of in the industry. That means they're using cash, they're using check cashing places. Maybe they're just using software like Venmo and choosing not to, for whatever reason. And I won't get into some of the reasons, but they're not using traditional checking and savings accounts. And that means they're not going to have that banking history that a bank is looking for. So I think there are lots of challenges and I'm just kind of skimming the surface, but these are challenges that I think are surmountable.
So Gene, you've got some local data now. You posited earlier that Central Ohio, while it may be second, is not unique. Blend in some of your research here with what you're learning from Michael and Karina.
Yeah, let me my research. I think what I might want to talk about is some of the tools that we've been developing around the country to address some of these issues. So let me mention 2 things I've been working on this year. So, and I'll mention some others that may be relevant to what Karina's describing. So I'll start with there. So we work, for example, for the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, which has made a major effort. Minnesota has the biggest discrepancy in Black and white home ownership rates in the country. So they've made a major effort in their programs, similar to the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, right? In their single family programs using mortgage readiness methods, using solicitations, working through through nonprofits and churches to dramatically increase. So they're making loans 3 times the number of households of color that the private banking system has been. So they've made concerted efforts. Massachusetts Housing has done similar things. So there are things one can do, at the lending side of this. And there's a new Bank of America initiative to deal with some of the issues you're finding. That's one thing. You can also think from a discrimination point of view, if lenders, appraisers, realtors lost their licenses for discrimination, it would have a chilling effect. It would have a difference. But I'll talk about 2 things I've been working on. So one is I've been doing a lot of, this year I worked for the California Treasurer's Office and the state legislature. And you want to think about California as the place you don't want to become, okay, in terms of a housing problem. And so what we designed and the legislature passed at the end of June is a shared appreciation loan program, a second mortgage program that'll be $1 billion a year for the state. It's not a housing subsidy program, for a state revolving investment fund to make shared appreciation loans with first-time home buyers. Okay, because it isn't, certainly we need programs that'll provide 3% of the down payment, 3% of the purchase price to cover closing costs. Those are programs that exist. They could be expanded, they could be deepened. We're in a situation in California where we have to go far beyond that in order to get the monthly payment on the mortgages to levels people can do. So to do this, so in effect, you put 3% down, the state invests 17% with you. So you get an 80% loan to value mortgage at a monthly payment you can afford, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. When you go to sell the house, you owe back the original amount subordinate to your down payment. So it's protecting people. And you pay no interest and no monthly payments. You pay the same percentage the state put up as the purchase price. The house goes up by $100,000. The state gets back $17,000. Why? That gives them the money to then help the next set of buyers, because this problem is not going to get easier. This problem is only going to get worse. So it's a revolving investment fund. 2 of the questions we were asked by the legislature in designing this were, one was, how can we use this as a tool, for racial equity, given all this history? But the California Constitution has an amendment that says you can't have racially restricted or targeted programs, including for minorities. So what I suggested instead was think about the program. It's not exactly a lottery, but for simplicity, think of it as a lottery, where everybody who's below 150% of median income can apply for such a loan. Obviously, we can't make loans to everybody because there's not enough money even in the California surplus. But secondly, we don't want to provide these loans for more than 2% of the purchases in a metropolitan area, because we don't want to further inflame a market that's already gone up like the rest of the country by 40%, but is in fact at astronomical levels now. So we said, okay, what we'll do is everybody below 150% gets like one chance as an application in this lottery pool, if you want to think of it. And those who've lived for at least 5 of the last 10 years in the historically most low-income neighborhoods of the state, they get 4 slots at this. And the notion is, if you think of what my book is about, is really how the odds were stacked against certain people. This is a way, or mathematically, in effect of trying to reverse or change some of those odds in a way that's not racially targeted. And it gives people choice. It says, if you live in this area, I say 5 of the last 10 years because people may have been gentrified out during that time. So you can use that loan to help buy a house in that neighborhood. Maybe it's rapidly gentrifying and this is anti-gentrification. You want to stay there. That's fine. Or maybe you want to move to a higher resource neighborhood. That's fine. Choice is what this is all about. So that's one thing. Then there's a second one.
Before you move on, I want to stick with California for just 1 minute, because Karina moved you. We only told people about your Columbus connections, but you made a reflection over dinner last night, and Gene really had a response to it. You're from San Diego. Talk about that.
Oh, I wasn't expecting that question. So yeah, I was born and raised in San Diego. I moved to Columbus 4 years ago. My background is also in city planning. In particular, I was doing a lot of affordable housing and homelessness prevention policy. And so those of you who hear San Diego, I mean, I get so many times people ask me, well, I'm so sorry, like, why did you move to Columbus? What happened? And one of the things I have to say and share is kind of like the dark side of prosperity. It's a really hard place to live if you are in poverty. And you see that physically on the streets. Like, you might go to the beach and say, I'm having a wonderful time. But if you were to walk many of the streets, especially in the downtown area, you would literally have to walk over someone who might be living on the sidewalk. And that's really hard. And in addition, because of some of the things that Gene mentioned, these are such deeply entrenched policy issues and housing cost issues. Earlier today, we were at a roundtable, and I could say pretty definitively, I might be wrong, but probably at least 90% of the people at this roundtable of professionals were homeowners. In my hometown, that would not be the case. I'd be lucky if it was 30%. And I had friends and family members who, as professionals making good salaries, were like, I'll never own a home, because if my parents didn't buy a home, it's never going to happen for me. And so I wanted to move someplace where I felt like an everyday person, just a working class person, could buy a house. Now, in the time I've been here, of course, even in 4 years, home prices have gone up, but still relative to other parts of the country, especially relative to the salaries here in Columbus, believe it or not, I didn't take much of a salary cut moving here from California. So relative to the salaries, you can work and you can buy a house here. It's just, we need to make that a little bit more of a priority. And of course, we still have people who are struggling every day. But I think, again, these are surmountable barriers. I like to keep the positive spin on it.
And we want to turn our attention now to like some of these solutions, right? So I just want you to level set what she said. You said California is exactly what you don't want to be. Where are we in Central Ohio in terms of opportunity?
California, we're now dealing with restricting single family zoning or trying to erode it because we've now reached a situation of such unaffordability that people recognize, their children aren't going to be able to buy homes. This is a problem that now affects everybody. But I think my way of thinking about this is you can think about it 2 different ways from Columbus's point of view. One is, what's going to be, listen to Michael's statistics, what's going to be 25 years from now? 25 years is a very long time. I mean, if you're getting a mortgage or you're building a rental property, all right, 25 years from now, if things aren't transformed in some way, where are you going to be in terms of these issues, in terms of inequality, in terms of housing prices, in terms of affordability that affects everybody, in terms of whether school teachers can afford to live in the communities where they're teaching, problems we're seeing lots of places around the United States. Another way, so that's one way of thinking about it. You know, if things continue in the same things that people are now doing with all the efforts they're now making, builders are making and nonprofits are making, just keep doing that at roughly the same pace and picture what's going to happen. Okay. That's maybe a question for Michael. Let me put that positive. You have an opportunity. You have an extraordinary opportunity. When you say the, average amount of debt people might be behind is $1,400, or Move to Prosper, it maybe costs what, $15,000 or $17,000 to help a family for 3 years try and improve themselves and create social mobility. And okay, do you know what that number would be in San Francisco? That would be $90,000, okay, at least, to do exactly the same thing. You have the possibility of helping people buy homes here with $10,000, $20,000, or $30,000 of down payment systems, not $250,000 of down payment systems. You have, and so this is an opportunity to create as much long-term affordability in the next few years as you possibly can through home ownership or long-term affordable rentals, in whichever methods, because this time is going away. I mean, I don't know, I saw from Realtor.com how average house price in Columbus has gone up. Said I couldn't believe this, in 5 years by 85%.
That sounds about right.
Okay, so think about that, and think about what's happening to the potential affordability and who can buy homes today versus 5 years from now. If you act on that now, if we provide the resources and the tools and zoning changes and so forth, if we help builders make it possible and financially attractive, we're doing this in Montana, to help builders build more modest single family homes. And the average size of, at the same time as affordability is escalated, unaffordability is escalated around the country, the average size of a single family home being built today in the United States is double what it was, 30 years ago. Okay. But builders make more money on selling larger homes. So in Montana, we're using state ARPA funds from federal, money from pandemic to help provide, basically covering the infrastructure and sewer and other costs, developers, so they can make the same amount of profit they would have made on more expensive. So there are tools, I think, that are possible, but the most important thing for me that I take away from this and from being on this tour today is the scale of the opportunity and the importance of timing. This isn't the time, and I see Intel being built, and I see all the other stuff that's going to happen, and this imbalance of supply and demand and how it can easily keep getting worse. This is the time to take every action you can, because just like those redlining maps and the lack of household equity compounded over time, the actions you take today can compound over time.
He's singing your song, Michael. We've got a room full of activists and people who want to do better. Do we have those tables that are gathering that are trying to take this opportunity and run with it that you're aware of?
Well, let me kind of throw out some additional statistics that are kind of future oriented. Clearly, this has been a growing metropolitan region, and with Intel, Nationwide Children's Hospital, and what we see happening over Ohio State, there is no doubt in any of our minds that this coming decade will most notably have more growth. Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, before the Intel announcement, has predicted we'll add 1 million people in the next 30 years. They're now revising that methodology, and we'll see what they come up with. If all things are just held equal with regard to the percentage of people and where they are in income bands, and if you take the economic distribution presently, that means there will be 300,000 more low-income people living in this metropolitan region in 30 years versus today. And so a very academic question is, where do you think they should live? Where do you want to put them? Someone said to me the other day, who deserves to live on tree-lined streets? Think about that. I mean, who actually does live on tree-lined streets? And then who really deserves to live on tree-lined streets? Because guess what? You can look at Google satellite images of Columbus and you can see based on tree canopy where redlining was and where those tier 1 neighborhoods are. Because when you look for Grandview and Arlington and Clintonville and Worthington on Google satellite, it looks like you're looking at a national forest. If you go to Linden and Milo Grogan, you see lots of rooftops and lots of pavement and lots of hot surfaces. And by the way, the city of Columbus recently just measured the temperature in every single neighborhood in Columbus on the same day to see what is the temperature variation between high-income neighborhoods and low-income. In Portland, Oregon, it's a 23-degree difference in the summer in low-income neighborhoods. So think about the long-term impacts today of heating bills. What's it like when youth in the summer, right, are that hot and can't find shade, and what that does to all those other things. So then there's kids that are misbehaving, community violence, all that kind of stuff. All right, so back to the million people, 300,000 are going to be low income. Up until now, the city of Columbus has really taken the moral responsibility to house the region's poor. Well, why is that? And should that continue? And as the city of Columbus is no longer using annexation, right, the growth of the city has kind of run to its limit. I can tell you exactly where low-income people are going because you can set your watch to the mobility of poverty in this community. And it is moving up Cleveland Avenue and Westerville Road, and it is moving out Broad, Livingston, and James like an unstoppable juggernaut. Poverty's not going to Dublin, it's not going to Powell, it's not going to New Albany, and it's moving away from downtown in those concentric rings. So what are the choices that we need to make today, right? Just removing racist systems isn't really changing outcomes, or the demographics of places like Worthington and Clintonville and Grandview Heights should probably look different after 50 years. The question is, why don't they look different? Why is it that either people don't feel welcome, right, by going to those places, which I think is a real thing, or there's something else about the history of that community that is putting up the invisible wall is still very real for a lot of people. And so I think those are just questions we have to start asking ourselves in a more thoughtful way. What should we look like in 30 years? Who should take the moral responsibility to house the region's poor? And why is it after 50 years of the removal of some of those laws, are so many parts of Columbus really unchanged? And who's asking those questions about the future growth of our city? And while Columbus is looking at things like completely rewriting its zoning code, right? As the city of Columbus will have on the bond package in 2 months, a $200 million bond package for affordable housing, right? Only the second time in Columbus history where they put affordable housing in a bond package. They did it in 2019, it was $50 million. It generated about 1,300 units of permanent affordable housing and leveraged $250 million of affordable housing production. What about the bond capacity in other cities? Is Dublin and Upper Arlington using its bond authority to provide land buy downs, right? Or bring down the cost to do affordable housing? Are the zoning codes in other communities not letting the city grow, right? Or build the housing stock that it needs? And I'll kind of wrap this up by saying, a home is where a job goes at night. And our region's been really good at getting jobs, right? But somehow we're not putting the welcome mat up for housing. And I hope that as we become educated by reading things like Gene's book, that we're not replicating, unbeknownst to ourselves, that we are actually replicating systemic systems of oppression without knowing so. And the question is, how do we get our metropolitan region to have a housing abundant strategy, right? And how do we use public policy like zoning codes and public transit and tax abatements, right, to build the city that we need to have by 2050? Because to Gene's point, we will be California in 30 years, because everything about our trend line suggests that we're on that path. We're just behind it at a slower pace.
Let me just one sentence, because I think it may be helpful to think about this. During the pandemic, just in the last 2.5 years, the household wealth of homeowners in this country has gone up by $6 trillion. There's a similar number for the wealth of landlords with lower capitalization rates and higher rents. But let's just take the $6 trillion figure. And what does that equate to? In San Jose, the average homeowner has $300,000 more wealth than they did 2.5 years ago. Maybe here it's $75,000 more wealth. So suddenly you're $75,000 wealthier. How did that happen? What did you do that created that? Where did that come from? What that number is, what it represents, is the additional payments that somebody who's not a homeowner is going to have to make either buy a home or an additional rent. Those rents keep pace with prices. That money is a transfer. It's not suddenly, you won a lottery. It's a payment that's being made. So I think it's useful to think about that as we think about where does this come from and where does it put the broader community in terms of its ability to be a livable place as a whole, in terms of commuting, jobs for teachers and policemen and everything else. 25 years and I'll shut up.
No, great. So I want to get our questions from the audience up here, but Karina, I want to just give you a couple of minutes. Michael's suggesting kind of a government-centric approach. Who you elect and how often you call and ask for change is really important to what's ahead, right? Is this entirely a government problem, or do you see other solutions?
So as someone who worked for local government for half a decade or more, I love government. I think it's an important piece of the problem, but I also think we can't subsidize our way out of this issue. The private sector has to be a part of the equation. One of the things we've learned is that the private sector was a part of the creation of the problem, right? So we had the mortgage industry and also the Realtors Association for probably rather capitalistic reasons. I'd like to say capitalistic versus just pure racist, right? So for capitalistic reasons, created some of the problems that we see today, and then we see the legacy of that, but they can also be a part of the solution. Whether or not their motivations are also capitalistic, because I actually think equity is good for everyone's bottom line. At the end of the day, more homeowners, more people allowed to buy homes also means more buyers for the houses you might be selling one day, right? So you want more people out there, you want more competition for your homes. So I think the private sector is an important part of the solution. One of the things that excites me about the coalition that I run, Convergence Columbus, is we have everyone who is involved in the purchase of a home at the table together. So they're in the same place, trying to come up with solutions to these problems at the same time. So it can't just be nonprofits and government. We also need our local real estate agents. We need our loan officers at the table as well. So we need all hands on deck, and we all stand to benefit. So they're having this conversation because their interests align. We all want more minority homeowners. It's going to be good for the region. We know that that's where our population growth is coming from. We also know that if we keep adding people, but we don't create more homeowners, we're going to have that persistent poverty that Michael talked about. Homeownership is the way you get out of poverty in many cases. You might not see it that way. You might see, renter and poverty and renter, and the homeownership is an affluence, but it doesn't have to be that way. I see homeownership as a path to social mobility. And so I just want to kind of underline, there's a lot of social benefits to loosening those barriers.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience who submitted questions. I do want to end on time. So we've just got about 10 minutes and a stack that looks like that. So I'm going to call on you and ask you to kind of be brief. Karina, you did an amazing job of answering question number one. And the second one happens to be for you too. What are some things we can do as first-generation homeowners to dispel the negative myths about homeownership?
Oh, I love that. So one of the things that I found interesting that Gene mentioned is that the FHA, like first-time homebuyer loans, were actually created to help white folks buy homes. And fast forward many generations, those same FHA loans are actually looked at negatively. So often I think they can be a proxy for poverty. So a lot of times when buyers are trying to compete, they are using these programs, and with good intentions, I think their real estate agents are often saying, well, maybe you shouldn't accept that buyer's, that contract, because it might be a little bit harder to get all the way to closing. So why don't you take this other offer? And so I think one of the things we need to do is really, attack and hopefully erase the stigma around first-time home buyer, because we still have them. A lot of them are just young people, young professionals trying to get their foot in the door. And if they're using these programs, it should be looked at as a positive and not a negative.
Thank you. The question asks about the point you made about zoning laws, Michael, and this is asking why does Central Ohio approach this in a township by township by municipality approach, and mentions that Metro Indianapolis, for instance, has a regional zoning code, but that's not how we do it here. Do you think that's a solution?
Yeah, so I don't want to be too far in my comfort zone, but there is home rule in the Ohio Constitution, which allows individual communities to have control over their own destiny. And so there are plenty of places where they look at regional strategies when it comes to, say, tax revenue sharing in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or in Montgomery County, Maryland. They had the moderately priced dwelling unit ordinance, which was about economically integrating housing across that entire county. So I think that there are plenty of examples across the country that Columbus could look to, but I think what it comes down to is this sense of those individual communities don't want to be the only one or the first one to do it. I am also, like Karina, an optimist. I want to point out that Columbus, Bexley, help me out, Carly, Worthington, Whitehall, Westerville, and one other community, Reynoldsburg, and now Gahanna is considering a source of income protection ordinance, which just basically says all legal sources of income must be looked at by a landlord to approve somebody's quality to get that unit, meaning child support, alimony, Social Security, disability payments. Similarly, and very eerie to what Gene was talking about, this whole sense of freedom, there are some landlords that have been fighting that source of income discrimination ordinance by saying, well, we want to have the freedom as landlords of who we rent to based on their, earned, how they make their money. Bexley was the first community in Central Ohio that approved one of those source of income protections. And I know there's a group called Quality Upper Arlington, Equal UA, I knew I was close. That's kind of looking at those same kind of systems there. So at the moment, individual communities are in their own path of discovery to get to a place of equity. And we have some nice examples. I don't know that I have a lot of confidence that in the state of Ohio or within our metropolitan region, we're going to find a region-wide solution to that. That being said, the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission did complete the Regional Housing Strategy Framework, which gives ex-urban, suburban, and urban communities real tactical tools on how they can lean into housing abundant strategies. And I think those are going to be even more important as the growth of the metropolitan region accelerates.
Thank you. Another zoning question, Gene, I'm going to direct this at you. How do you recommend a community that has a legacy of these invisible walls approach tearing them down? Is this a zoning question?
Well, zoning is clearly one of the key issues. And a couple of things I learned from today was just seeing the difficulties, including in Worthington, with conditional use permits to get approvals of projects. We saw this in Columbus, we saw this in Worthington, we saw in several places that create these gray zones of contention rather than making zoning that includes inclusionary units a matter of right and simply in the zoning code. That's an important thing one can build in an inclusionary zoning. If you're building more than 20 units, to 20% of them be affordable, whatever. That's a standard thing in many other parts of the country. That's a tool that communities can use.
And another question actually directly from your book. Can you talk about the connection between early suburban developers and the realtors? How did those two paths begin to converge?
Well, they were the same people.
Ah.
The major developer, the ones I mentioned, were in fact members of real estate boards and the presidents of their local real estate board, the ones who were the most innovative and helped create zoning and planning regulations. They were the presidents of real estate boards.
So pretty much in the same mind. Yeah.
Same people. And they they purchased and created many of the first savings and loans.
Final question. I think this is a great place to end, and I'll allow each of you a chance to answer. Gene, we can end with you, and Karina, maybe I'll ask you to start. What do you suggest average people, these folks here in the room, do today to help with housing disparities? What's top of mind for you? What can these folks do?
I'm going to say two things, but they'll both be short. I think thinking about the future and the fact that we want to have housing for all people, that means people just starting out who maybe need a studio or a one-bedroom. It could be people at the end of their life who need a small ranch house and not a big, second story house. And so we need a diverse range of housing options, which means we need to build more than just big single family homes that are in neighborhoods that are not your neighborhoods. So just being open to the idea that your neighborhood can start to change the way it looks, but still retain the things that you love about it. And that means allowing more housing to be built in places where it makes sense. So we're going to have to build to accommodate the new people. Often we're going to have to build things that look a little different than they do now. And so being open to that idea is one. And then the second one is a really quick one. If you do go to sell your house and you see that the person who is trying to buy your house is using a program like FHA, think to yourself, wow, this is someone who probably without this program might not be able to buy a house. And so maybe I'm going to give them a chance, even if my realtor says, don't accept that offer. It's not as strong as this other one because they're using this program. Just be open to it and maybe do your own research.
Thank you for those. Michael.
Yeah, so this is not an official United Way response. This is just my personal opinion. If you live in Columbus, please vote for the bond package. When CODA comes up on the levy and they want to implement Link-Us, which is a $9 billion transportation plan that irrevocably reshape urban geography around fixed guideway transit, please advocate and support it. If you live in Columbus, go to your freaking area commission meetings and push back when those commissions try to fight density. Density is not a problem. Density is our friend. And every time we make a developer cut a floor off of a building, 6 stories, by the way, is not a high rise. Every time we have to, make that developer add more parking or knock off a floor, well, before you know it, we just suppressed another 2,000 units getting built across the metropolitan region last year, right? And if you don't live in Columbus, is your local community looking at its zoning code? Is it still, representing, archaic and anti-urban, pro-car, low-density, kind of racist policies? And is your local community using its full weight of its financial strength to invest in housing abundant strategies? And I will close by saying, economic self-sufficiency on the urban periphery is not a sufficient defense for isolationism, okay? Economic self-sufficiency on the urban periphery is not a sufficient defense for isolationism. Yes, Intel is going to New Albany, but Intel is coming to the metropolitan region, right? And all of us should be benefiting from that. And I think everybody should be, in my opinion, taking their fair share of both the benefits as well as the challenges of the metropolitan region. To me, that is a community that aligns its moral compass with equity.
And Gene, we've got about 30 seconds for you to inspire this crowd. So no pressure, go.
I'll take more than 30 seconds, but the simplest answer I can think of, I can't tell you the specific thing in Ohio, but neighbors came to the door of my son last week, who lives in an upper middle class neighborhood near Palo Alto, near Stanford. And he's a school teacher at a charter school. And they wanted him to sign a petition preventing fourplexes from being built in single family neighborhoods. And he said, hell no. My son had written his senior thesis at Berkeley on the same topic that I then wrote this book on, which my book is dramatic expansion of. So you take that to your equivalent of the neighborhood meeting that you choose to attend to speak up for a project or not to sign a petition or whatever it is. The one other thing I'll say is and because this involves discussions we've had with Senator Brown's office, and we've had with the White House, which is proposing, as we see these hedge funds buying lots of single family homes, including many in minority neighborhoods, and making it harder for families to buy homes, reducing that amount, forcing greater competition, forcing up prices. We've proposed a way of using the same tax code, just as we set a limit on mortgage interest deductions for an individual, set them on the general partners who establish these limited partnerships, and say, if you're above that amount, above say $75 million, we'll give you the same tax benefit when you sell that house to a first-time home buyer. So use the tax code, make changes that make it easier for people to buy homes rather than harder for people to buy homes.
All right, we're going to leave it there. I think you can probably, if you did not get your question answered, rely on this panel, esteemed as they are, to stick around maybe 10 or 15 minutes and engage you in individual conversation. My thanks to Karina Johnson, Michael Wilkos, and Gene Slater for joining us for Building Inclusive Communities. Thank you to the McConnell Arts Center for hosting us tonight, and to our sponsors on the screen. If you're into this sort of conversation and you want to continue it with us, please mark your calendars for November 16th. The next Building Inclusive Communities series is called Visualizing Density. Aha! Legalizing housing in Central Ohio. And that's a lot of what you're taking away in terms of inspiration. But since that does fall after Election Day, don't forget to vote your values and be at the polls on November 8th. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you.